Hi guys, yesterday we talked about how great this war was. Uh, 40 million casualties at the end of it in just 4 years. And we talked about why that was with all these horrible new technologies and innovations that are making uh, killing so much easier and more efficient. So this war turns into an absolute debacle. And so what we're going to look at for the next couple days is why in the world would the United States choose to get involved? When we're 3,000 miles away from this war, why are we going to get involved and lose American lives and risk, losing status in the world if we were to lose the war? So that's what we're going to be looking at is kind of what's going to lead us to getting involved in this war. So we talked about that the four main causes of the war are militarism, the top left, right? These European nations are racing to build the strongest militaries they can, build the strongest navies, armies, and on the right side, the alliance system is creating this domino effect that anytime there's a conflict, it becomes a huge problem because all these countries are connected in this complicated web of political and military alliances. Then in the bottom left, the imperialism that all of these countries have a thirst for empire, which is creating an atmosphere of competition that is not healthy. It's when you combine it with militarism, the competition can turn violent pretty quick, as we'll see in World War One. And then the bottom right, the nationalism, that people are just blindly patriotic toward their nation, not really thinking about the interests of humanity or the world at large. They're just thinking about their own interests as a nation and competing with each other for world domination. Now, as we talked about, those are the causes of the war. The spark that starts the war is the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He's shot in Serbia, and this starts the chain of events that leads to the war beginning. Uh, when he is assassinated, immediately Austro-Hungary becomes angry at Serbia for obvious reasons. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire sends an ultimatum to Serbia, like we talked about yesterday, where they're basically saying, look, you have to let us do the following things or we're going to have a problem. Now, this isn't even, the list here isn't even the end of the list. They sent a long ultimatum, and ultimately, really everybody agreed. Everyone from Britain to Germany, everyone agreed that this ultimatum was it was not reasonable. And so Serbia had no choice but to reject the ultimatum, and they immediately turned to their allies, Russia, and say, "Hey, can you got to have our backs if something goes down here." And meanwhile, Austria-Hungary is doing the same thing. They're getting the backing of the Germans. The Germans give Austria-Hungary a blank check of support. Whatever goes down, we've got your back. And so we can see this alliance system is causing some problems. And so on July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and then Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary, and Germany declares war on Russia, and France declares war on Germany, and then Britain declares war on Germany because they're allied with France, and we have a world war after a seemingly not an insignificant incident in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but certainly not one that warrants a great war. But nonetheless, we have a war, whether we like it or not. So this war is going to be waged for 4 years. Millions of lives, as we have talked about, will be lost, and millions of other lives will be affected forever, losing family members, refugees having to leave the country. This war is going to have incredible effects on world history and European history, as we've talked about. It's a hugely significant moment in human history, especially when it comes to the 20th century. And so just to kind of go over the basics of the war, we want to know who's fighting. So we have two sides. We basically have what are called the Triple Alliance, originally becomes known as the Central Powers, and it originally was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. But Italy is actually going to change sides during this war and join the Allied powers. So the Central Powers become Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and some other smaller countries. But those are kind of the main Central Powers. On the Allied powers side, we have Russia, France, and Great Britain that formed kind of that triple entente, and they're coming to the aid of Serbia. And eventually, the United States, when they do join the war, they will join on the Allied powers side, obviously, fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary. So let's look at just a couple things going on in the early years of the war. So most military leaders of the time predicted the war would be over pretty quickly. Uh, Germany, they found themselves, as you can see on this map, they are going to have to fight a two-front war. They're between two enemies, Russia and France. And so, it's going to be a difficult war if they're having to send troops to both sides to fight on the Western Front and the Eastern Front. The Western Front being against France, the Eastern Front being against Russia. So the Germans come up with this plan called the Schlieffen Plan, named for a general who came up with this idea. And they decided that they're going to invade as quickly as possible France. You can see that arrow. They're going to go through Belgium as fast as possible and get to Paris and basically knock France out of the war so fast that Russia, they're going to knock France out of the war before Russia could mobilize its armies. So Germany can knock France out of the war, reach a peace settlement with them, and then concentrate all their efforts on the Eastern Front. That was their plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Now, the problem with that is that France and Belgium have set up some fortifications, and they're ready to fight the Germans. So what ends up happening is a series of battles where Germany invades France, but the Allied powers are able to repel the Germans and basically prevent Germany from getting to Paris and knocking France out of the war quickly. And what this turns into is that the Germans and the French dig trenches in front of each other, and they sit in those trenches and fight battles for the rest of the war on this Western Front, really never gaining any territory in any direction. It just becomes a horrific recipe for death and destruction on the Western Front. Let me take a sip of my coffee. Nectar of the gods. And so this is kind of what trench warfare would look like, right? These soldiers on both sides are going to live in these trenches for weeks and months on end during these battles that are going to rage on. We talked about yesterday some of the things that they're facing, right? They're facing artillery strikes. These shells are being slammed into their trenches day and night. It's a horrific way to live. We also talked about the poison gas, the development where, the Germans would shoot poison gas into the trenches, and then it would spread through the trenches and make it very difficult, if not impossible, to breathe. They're also dealing with trench foot. We talked about that. There's mud. There are rats. It's just a horrific place to live. And then, every so often they're being asked to run out of the trenches and go fight a battle. And when they go fight those battles, it's just, they're being machine gunned down by the thousands. I mean, the losses, the casualties are unbelievable. You can see the picture on the left, what it would have been like to live in those trenches. It's just not a comfortable way to live. And on the right, you can see them with their masks on, and once they figured out how to respond to the development of poison gas. And so just to highlight some of the major battles on the Western Front, in September of 1914, so very early in the war, we have the Battle of the Marne. And this is the battle where the French are able to push the Germans back and prevent them from getting to Paris and knocking them out of the war. And at that battle, the Battle of the Marne, 500,000 casualties, 500,000 in one battle. Uh, it didn't last just one day, but still, 500,000 casualties in one battle is insane. We also want to highlight the Battle of the Somme. This is a really well-known battle. Over 1 million casualties at the Battle of the Somme. And then during that same year, the Battle of Verdun, which was fought from February till December. So what's that, 10 months? A 10-month battle, over 1 million casualties. So just at those three locations alone, we're going to see 2.5 million casualties in a war that will eventually see 40 million total casualties. So the Western Front becomes an absolute stalemate. They can't move any direction. It's just a mess. So there's also going to be battles fought on the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia. And really, you can tell already who's going to lose this war. Germany doesn't stand a chance fighting a two-sided war. But what else is going on? Once Britain joins, they send their very powerful navy to block Germany. They set up a blockade. This sea right here, let me get my pen here. This sea right here is called the North Sea, and this is going to be the location of a lot of the submarine warfare that's going to take place in World War I. The Germans and the British are going to fight a lot of battles there. The Germans are going to set up mines. The British are going to prevent any ships from passing through this area. So they're preventing Germany from receiving any supplies, and that's a problem. But this blockade is going to be pretty effective. Now the Germans are going to become famous for these U-boats. A U-boat, it's the word U-boat is short for Unterseeboot, which is the German way of saying under the sea boat, right? Or what we would call a submarine. The Germans are going to use these boats to harass British ships. Now, not just military ships, they're also going to harass ships that are just trade vessels. And some of those ships are going to have Americans on them, and that's going to become a problem for the United States. So, the war wages on. Now, while this war is waging on, the Americans have to consider what they're going to do. The United States is sitting across the Atlantic Ocean looking at this war waging, and they have to answer this question. Should the United States intervene? Remember, the United States is trying to be an imperial power. They're trying to extend their power and influence all over the world. So how can we ignore the Great War? We're going to try it first. So, I mean, you can see on this map how far away we are. And Woodrow Wilson, he was the president who was elected in 1912. And so he's president when this war breaks out, and he pretty quickly declares a policy of neutrality. In the tradition of Washington and Jefferson, Washington believed in neutrality. That was his foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson declares that the United States is not going to get involved in this war. We're going to stay out of it. We're going to stay isolated on the other side of the world. So our policy goes from being neutral to being isolated. Now, we're not really going to be isolated because we're still going to be sending ships to Europe to trade, which is going to be a problem. And then Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election for a second term in 1916 based on the fact that he kept us out of war in the first 2 years of the war. And these are some of the pins from that election, that there was war in Europe but peace in America, that Wilson kept us out of war. And this is going to allow him to be re-elected. He was popular because he kept us out of World War I. But as we know, we're going to be pulled into the war. As the war raged on, it became very difficult, impossible really, for the United States to stay neutral. The United States was still trading with European nations and sending supplies to some of those nations. And the Great Britain's blockade, Germany's mines and U-boats, all are interfering with U.S. ships entering the war zone. So this is going to make it impossible for us to stay neutral. So the question becomes, should we intervene in the Great War?